See, we're all recorded now. So with that, I will turn it over to Undersecretary of Energy and Climate Solutions, Judy Chang, to officially kick off the public hearing. Judy,
good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this third of a series of 3 public hearings on our clean energy climate plans for 2025 and 2030, which are required by our statute. We're using this 5 to 10-year climate plans as the foundation to develop the policies and strategies to set and meet the greenhouse gas emissions reduction for the Commonwealth. We had developed an interim clean energy climate plan for 2030 back in December of 2020. Since then, the 2021 climate law has required us to develop additional plans for 2025 and reissue the plan for 2030. The proposals in this presentation and in this hearing are based on policies and programs already underway and feedback that we've heard through stakeholders forums like this, and any new requirements set by the climate law. On this slide, you'll see the progress and the agenda for our presentation and our deliberation here. I will provide some important background material. I'll share with you some of the findings from our pathway analyses and how we set the limits and sublimits for both 2025 and 2030, key considerations for the policy development, and sector by sector goals and strategies through transportation, buildings, electric power, non-energy and industrial sectors, and natural and working lands. And then I will close with a few notes on next steps. This slide deck, which you can download from the website, has also 2 slides at the end that has the explanations of the terms and acronyms that might be included in the slide deck, but I won't be talking through that during the hearing. Next slide, please. As background, the 2021 climate law had added new requirements for limiting emissions and how we develop plans to meet those emission targets and to track them. Our clean energy climate plans are what the legislation also refers to as the roadmap plans. On emissions targets, the law has set a economy-wide emissions reduction of 50%, at minimum 50% reduction by 2030, and at least 75% reduction by 2040, and at least 85% reduction by 2050, and reach net zero emissions reduction by 2050. We're also required to set emissions limit for 2025, 2035, and 2045. Those are the interim years that are not set in the law. It also requires the Energy and Environmental Affairs Secretary to set sublimits for the following sectors: the electric power sector, transportation, commercial and industrial heating and cooling, residential heating and cooling, industrial processes, natural gas distribution systems and services, and any other sectors that we may designate. For natural working land, this is the first time a definition of natural and working lands is codified in the law. The legislation requires us that we track carbon flux on natural and working lands, set goals to reduce the emissions and increase carbon sequestration capabilities on these lands, and develop a plan to achieve these goals. In addition, we will designate specific metrics based on which we will set benchmarks and tracking for all of the sectors and economy-wide. Next slide, please. Further background, I think it will be important for us to explain some of the public comments that we have already received subsequent to the publishing of the interim 2030 plan. Since the interim plan was released, we have received over 1,000 written comments during the public comment period. we heard from many commenters that we should have more commitment and more specificity around few topics, including equity and environmental justice in our policies and supporting programs, ensuring a just transition by focusing on workforce development and training programs, especially for the underrepresented groups, and providing adequate funding and financing programs to support decarbonization. We're taking these comments very seriously, and therefore, hopefully you'll see that the new policies or the added policies reflect these comments. We have also heard specific feedback on our sector-specific policies, and on the slide, you'll see some high-level summaries of those perspectives. On transportation policies, many wanted more commitment on public transportation, programs to reduce car travel, incentives for low and moderate consumers to buy electric vehicles, more EV charging infrastructure, as well as electrification to extend more broadly to more vehicle types and classes. On building policies, we heard differing perspectives on building energy code that achieves net zero. We have heard different comments on different side of the aisle talking about how fast we should phase out incentives for oil and gas heating systems and how fast we should electrify our buildings versus adding biofuel and hydrogen to our heating systems. For electric power policies, many supported more renewable energy, including offshore wind, solar, and additional energy storage. We also heard concerns about siting ground mount solar projects and the land use impact associated with those projects. We have heard from some that they object to including biomass combustion to create electricity as part of a renewable portfolio standard. On non-energy policies, we heard concerns about natural gas leaks being undercounted in our statewide greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And we heard concerns from utilities that they may not be able to meet the regulations capping SF6 emissions with additional build out of the electricity infrastructure. And concerns from some of our commenters are regarding the emissions from waste incineration to produce electricity. On natural working lands, some commenters wanted additional urban tree planting. We also heard differing perspectives on forest management and durable wood products. Next slide, please. To provide you more background, just to explain that really the clock hasn't stopped since we published the interim 2030 plan. We wanted to give you some background on what has actually changed or what have shifted over the last 2 years. A number of things have happened since the release of the interim 2030 CECP, and even in just 1.5 years, some of the things listed on this slide will really help us meet our aggressive emissions reduction goals. However, in transportation, the Regional Transportation Climate Initiative program was put on hold as a large influx of federal funding is being made available for transportation infrastructure across the New England states. Meanwhile, the state of California updated its regulation requiring truck manufacturers to increase the sale of non-emitting trucks, and California is in the process of updating additional regulations requiring car manufacturers to increase the sale of non-emitting cars. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts is required by law to follow California vehicle emissions standards, particularly if these are more stringent than the federal policies. In the building sector, our 3-year energy efficiency plan for 2022 through 2024 was approved with strong commitment to weatherization, electrification, and a focus on serving our environmental justice communities to increase equity in the Mass Save program. Our Department of Energy Resources is updating the Stretch Energy Building Code and the Municipal Opt-in and Net Zero Energy Code as required by the 2021 Climate Law. Governor Baker also signed an executive order convening a commission on clean heat, and that commission is currently drafting preliminary recommendations on how to best to cap and reduce emissions from heating fuels in buildings. And I will talk more about that when we get to the building sector strategies and policies. In electric power, we are now authorized to procure 5.6 gigawatt of offshore wind. The renewable portfolio standard was also changed, increasing it to 40% of Massachusetts electricity to be produced and used from renewable energy by 2030. The climate law also established a municipal greenhouse gas emission standard, or the GGES, requiring 50% of electricity produced and used by municipal light plants and their customers to be from non-carbon emitting resources. As for bringing the additional hydro electricity energy from Canada to provide stable, clean energy to balance our intermittent renewable resources, there's an increased uncertainty associated with that project called the Clean Energy, New England Clean Energy Connect. In the non-energy and industrial process sector, the federal government is now phasing out the fluorinated gases, such as HFC, being used in refrigeration and aerosols. The phase out of these potent greenhouse gases will help curb rising emissions from this sector nationally, as well as throughout Massachusetts. Regarding the natural working lands, since last year, we have been improving our methodology for tracking biogenic carbon emissions and carbon sequestration on our lands. This effort is going to give us better estimations of how much emissions can be offset by carbon sequestration by our natural and working lands. Next slide, please. This slide shows a graphic that contains the actual historical emissions from the 4 different major sectors and our targeted emissions reduction for 2025 and 2030. It shows the historical actual for 2020 as an estimation through our Department of Environmental Protection, and on the white dot over 2025 will be our draft 2025 emissions target at 32%, reaching 50% economy-wide reduction in 2030. We have been updating the energy pathway analysis that drove really the release of the 2050 roadmap study, as well as continue to support the work we're doing here. The energy pathway analysis from 2020 up to now will reflect the new emissions reduction that's already reflected in the law of 2030 and 2040. And we conducted more refined analyses of various different ways to decarbonize buildings, particularly, and looked at decarbonization from a geographically specific methodology. The geographically specific analysis is being used also to analyze the potential impact on our diverse communities, urban, rural, EJ communities, and those that might be using oil and propane for heating versus natural gas today. Based on this work, we believe we can realistically achieve 32% emissions reduction in 2025 and on target to achieve 50% emissions reduction by 2030. The findings associated with this analysis show that the power sector, as you can see in the slide, in the graphic, the blue slice at the bottom, the power sector has decarbonized significantly in the last decade. This also means that to bring down the total emissions, the overall economy-wide emissions, we really need to lean hard on other sectors, particularly through 2030. Most of the policies, though, to drive down emissions by 2025 need to already be in motion, which is why we actually haven't stopped working on setting the policies as we prepare the plans for 2025 and 2030. But a lot of progress needs to continue to be made going into the future, as you can see on this graphic, particularly in the transportation and building sector, which are presented. The orange one, the slice above the blue, is the building sector, and the gray one is the transportation sector. You'll also notice, particularly in the gray section, due to the COVID pandemic in 2020, we saw a significant decrease in greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in the transportation sector in 2020. These are estimates that are estimates from our Department of Environmental Protection, because we don't have all the final numbers from our national databases yet. However, we think that these estimates are relatively accurate. This means that our overall greenhouse gas emissions in 2020, focusing on that blue dot, is actually lower than previously planned and lower than anticipated. We had set that target of 25% reduction by 2020 in the decade prior, and we had exceeded that expectation, but unfortunately, through much of it is driven by the COVID pandemic. This means that setting 32% emissions reduction in 2025, as you see on the graphic, which is lower than what we were able to achieve in 2020 via pandemic, sounds less aggressive than what one would usually think, but compared to what we had experienced in 2020, one can imagine what it requires, the dramatic changes that we must make to just get to 2025. Getting an economy-wide reduction that is above and beyond COVID that has made us achieve really requires significant effort. And we have already started that, all the policies and programs, and we're adding on that through this plan and the plan for 2030. At 32% reduction by 2025, though, we need to lean harder on the second half of the decade, because we really need to further reduce, as you can see in the orange and the gray section of this graphic, further reduce the emissions from our buildings and transportation through the rest of the decade. Next slide. This slide shows you how we're setting the sublimits. The left-hand side shows you the sectors that the climate law requires us to set the sublimits. We outline the sectors on the left-hand side to line up in the greenhouse gas emissions inventory that's produced by DEP on the right-hand side, which is the standard for which we measure compliance with emissions reduction targets. It is important to note that the climate law requires to set emissions limits for residential heating and cooling, and then separately commercial industrial heating and cooling. Those are the language and the sectors called out in the climate law. However, the greenhouse gas inventory tracks emissions from electric consumption across all sectors, and those are tracked at the power plant level, which is at the burner tip where the emissions actually occurs. So through stakeholder processes and the way we are continue to track emissions, we are proposing and we're setting the limits, sublimits for residential heating only and commercial industrial heating under those rows that you see in the middle of the table, whereas the cooling, which are primarily in the residential and commercial sectors, are primarily driven by power or electricity. Those will be set in the power sector because they are being tracked at the power plant levels. On the right-hand side is also how we group these sectors in our 2025 and 2030 clean energy climate plans. So when we talk about the policies, we're going to talk about these in aggregate: electric power, transportation, buildings, which include residential and commercial heating, as well as the fourth segment, which is non-energy industrial, where we include all the industrial processes and natural gas distribution and any other sectors that have greenhouse gas emissions. While this is the way we discuss them in this deck, when we author the Clean Energy Climate Plan, we will comply with the specific sector spelled out in the law, specifying, of course, that this delineation between the heating and cooling in the residential and commercial sectors. Next slide, please. In this slide, there are many numbers, and I'm going to go through them slowly here. In this table, we indicate the proposed emission levels for each sector, each via list sublimits in both 2025 and 2030. So in the middle of the table, you see the 2025 greenhouse gas emissions sublimits and the percentage change from 1990 level. And then on the outer right edge, you see that the 2030 greenhouse gas sublimits, again, the number in million metric ton, as well as the percentage on the outer edge. We have also included the emissions level with the same methodology, accounting methodology, in 1990 and the estimated amount in 2020 for reference, because we want to show you the emissions reduction relative to 1990 level, and really 2020 is approximately the closest numbers we have for sort of most recent estimates. For the power sector, just very briefly, and I'll go into each sector in a little bit later. For the power sector, we need to continue to find ways to support the sector by building clean energy, import them, procure them. That's how we can bring down the emissions from our power sector. We also need to get the reforms we need for the wholesale electricity market and the way that transmission is planned out for the region. And I will talk a little bit more about that when we get to the power sector. For transportation, our proposed 2030 sublimits for this sector is more aggressive than what was indicated in the interim CECP. We see this great potential to accelerate the market for EVs, given recent commitments from automakers, increase in federal investments and vehicle emission standards coming out of California. We also see greater potential for reducing total personal vehicle travel in the state in the wake of the pandemic, as hybrid work schedules for some people may help in reducing emissions in transportation. And also as our cities and towns expand infrastructure for alternatives to personal vehicles. We need to set policies and programs to build on these trends. So there's still a lot of work to do, but we see that there is greater potential for further reduction than we had previously anticipated just in a year and a half ago in the transportation sector. We need to set the policies to help accelerate the market for EVs, to create walkable and bikeable communities, and to capture the benefits of less commuting that we had witnessed through the pandemic. The decarbonization of residential heating, though, will require some more time to do because of the cost and the equitably distribution of those equipment. We're beginning to see traction across the country, but it is not as fast as we anticipated. There are now new businesses trying to figure out ways to decarbonize buildings, working with one community at a time, one building at a time. Here in Massachusetts, our most recent 3-year energy efficiency and energy transition plan has allocated roughly $4 billion over 3 years to help with the transition, and that work has just begun. Because of that, the proposed sublimit for residential heating will be less than indicated in the interim plan, though still very aggressive compared to the levels today. And I will get into more of that when we get to the building sector. The proposed sublimit for commercial industrial heating is relatively close to what we had already indicated in the interim plan. For the industrial processes, we are actually anticipating greater reduction, primarily because of the replacement of CFCs with HFCs. The reduction prior to 2020 is due to the replacement of CFCs to HFCs, but we now see a federal policy across the country to reduce the HFCs, which are greenhouse gases in our refrigerants and aerosols. So the phasing out of HFCs have just begun, and we think that with the recent federal actions, it will take some time for it to be completely eliminated, but we anticipate that will occur in Massachusetts as well. Okay, next slide, please. Wanted to share with you some of the key considerations as we develop these plans. To reach the 2025 and 2030 emissions limits and sublimits that I just shared with you, we have to simulate replacing fossil fuel equipment and products at the end of their useful life with cleaner alternatives. We've always said through the roadmap analysis that that is the least cost path to transition, folks. We want to capture those moments when equipment are turning over to encourage consumers to change over to cleaner technologies. When we then develop a portfolio of policies and together help us achieve those limits and sublimits. And so what we did is we conducted an analysis setting the goals of reaching economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and finding the least cost pathway to achieve those emissions reduction while meeting the energy demands across the sectors, including making sure that there are reliability reserves for all the sectors. The policy strategies include transition to clean energy economy, ensuring environmental justice and equity. We have considered significant stakeholder input and ensure that what we're setting out to do is practical and feasible. So on the right-hand side, this is really a balancing act of creating the right policies to drive change. One is that, again, as I said, we need to make sure that energy supply and delivery is available and reliable while we conduct this transition. We need to meet the GHG emissions reduction. We need to care for consumers, make sure that they're protected from any drastic cost increases, and make sure that we capture the most benefits to our consumers. We want to balance and make sure that our environmental justice communities are accounted for as we do the transition, so no one is left behind, and they may actually be helpful in leading the charge in the transition. We've also taken into account many stakeholder inputs via forums like this one and other written comments and other one-on-one discussions. And most importantly, we want to encourage market transformation. We need to set incentives and policies to encourage the markets to move, whether it's EVs or heat pumps or just a transition to cleaner technology. We need to send signals to the private sector that the market needs to shift. And then just as importantly, we need to make sure that the implementation is feasible and not increase administrative burden for many entities involved. Next slide, please. I wanted to paint a picture for you what it means to do all of these things, to reduce the emissions drastically through the next 8 years, getting to 2030. So if we put ourselves and imagine ourselves in 2030, this is what the world needs to look like. We need most of the passenger vehicle sales to be zero emission or EVs, and a growing share of medium heavy duty vehicles to be EVs or ZEVs. Massachusetts residents need to drive a little less. And hopefully that's because of better biking and pedestrian infrastructure and more housing near transit and less people driving and commuting to work. For the building sector, for both residential and commercial, we expect and need 1/3 of our homes to have tighter building envelopes, and these are existing buildings and are heated and cooled by electric heat pumps. We need our commercial industrial buildings to also transition to electric or other low carbon heating systems. We need our building owners and occupants across the state to have access to clear guidance, technical assistance, and gap funding for clean heat solutions. That's what 2030 will need to look like. For the power sector, we need 2/3 of our electricity consumption in Massachusetts. And by the way, that's increasing because we're electrifying transportation and buildings. We need 2/3 of that electricity to be consumed, to be coming from renewable and clean energy resources. And we hope, if we're successful with our policies and investments, that solar and offshore wind, Massachusetts will stand to be a regional economic powerhouse, so that we're not only building, but also operating significant amount of renewable energy that's located right near our shores and on our land, operating, ensure that we have consistent and reliable grid services, as well as accounting for land impact of the solar development. And for the rest of the sector, we will need cooling system to use refrigerants that do not damage the ozone layers and are less potent greenhouse gases. We need to recycle more, less plastics, mattresses, and organic waste in our trash, and less trash overall. So for the next 5 slides, I will go through each of the sector in more granularity. First, transportation. Next slide, please. Each of these 5 slides have, it's set up so that you can see what was proposed in the interim CECP back in 2020 and what we're already setting into motion from that plan and what's being proposed new for the 2025 and 2030 CECP. And also the middle row will show you the greenhouse gas emissions sublimits for the sector as reflected in the previous slides and the key metrics for the transportation sector. And each of these 5 sector slides will be shown in this way. In transportation, the primary driver for deep decarbonization is electrification of vehicles, and the primary policy will encourage electrification of our vehicle fleet in both of the 2025 going forward and 2030 CECP. And we will be implementing vehicle emission standards set by California. And as California finalizes its advanced clean truck standards and their clean car standards, we have already set in motion a way to follow from Massachusetts. We have moved forward on 2 key programs to encourage electrification of medium and heavy duty vehicles. DOER's More EV Truck provides incentives for medium and heavy duty vehicles, while the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center's Fleet Advisory Services program offers commercial fleet operators the opportunity to do a thorough infrastructure, logistics, cost, and technology assessment to help the fleet owners make the transition to EV in the years to come as more models become available. We're proposing additional policies to speed up the electrification of transportation with a focus on electrifying vehicles with important equity and public health benefits. This includes a focus on electrifying school buses, vehicles for hire, and delivery trucks. We launched our school program earlier this year with a focus on putting Massachusetts school districts in a strong position to compete for federal funding and electrify vehicles that directly contribute to air pollution reduction that impact our children. We see vehicle for hire as an important opportunity as well to get EVs in the hands of high mileage drivers with high public visibility. And with the rise of e-commerce, particularly during the pandemic, we made delivery trucks, the delivery trucks represent a growing source of emissions, both near our ports and near our residential communities. So we want to provide incentives for delivery vans and trucks with high mileage to transition to zero emission vehicles. Funding for these programs are included in the Mass Track, which is a $9.7 billion infrastructure bond bill that Governor Baker just filed a month ago. We also aim to secure additional funds through other mechanisms, and we're working with our legislature and the legislator partners in securing these funds to make sure that we have additional funding to advance the electrification of our transportation systems. We're moving ahead with reforms with the current More EV program that will make the program more equitable and cost-effective by focusing incentives on less expensive vehicle classes and providing additional incentives for low and moderate income residents and target high mileage or rural drivers. These programs will require additional funding as well. Again, we're working with our legislative partners on securing the funds to do so. We're placing more emphasis on strategies to reduce total vehicle miles traveled. At the end of the day, the less we use cars, the better it is for congestion and the better it is for our environment. So this was something that all of our stakeholders and the public care a lot about, and an opportunity to highlight some of the steps that the administration is already taking is worthwhile here, because these efforts are to provide people with alternatives to personal vehicles to get around. This includes increased ongoing commitment to the Complete Streets and Shared Streets programs, which have helped make Massachusetts a national leader on multimodal transportation infrastructure. We want to support the MBTA bus modernization program and the housing choice and the MBTA communities, which will help us build more housing near public transit. Also mentioned earlier, in the wake of the pandemic, we see greater potential to work with the employers to reduce unnecessary travels. Therefore, we'll pursue a statewide approach, working with employers to start a new program. Our overall metric for this sector includes our analysis for potential for EVs in Massachusetts, and we're really focused on that. The projection for total number of charging stations is another metric that we want to track. And as shown in the slide deck here, these are the metrics that we hope to achieve through 2025 plan and the 2030 plan. And we will be tracking these metrics as we go forward. Next slide, please. For the building sector, as I mentioned earlier, a commission on clean heat was set up, and I'm very grateful for the 22 commission members that have been working really hard in the last 3 to 4 months to deliberate and discuss what the methodologies would be to reduce the emissions from our heating of buildings. While they're still deliberating on the final recommendations, we have included some of those that we think are likely to be revealed through that commission. The actual recommendations range from very specific and targeted efforts, as well as broad policies. So broad policies, and we have included some of those policies on this deck. Over the coming months, the commission will continue to deliberate, and they will continue to work on some of the recommendations that you see on the slide, and they will continue to finalize the recommendation through the end of the year. Again, I want to really thank those people that were on the commission and the task force that has been set up to support the commission, because they have been working very hard in the last few months to come up with ideas and supporting policies, and that to help us develop the policies here for the 2025 and 2030 CECP. I want to cover a few highlights here. One, declining cap on emissions from building heat. With the emissions set for buildings for 2025 and 2030, as you see on the slide in the middle of the slide here, as well as in the previous slide by residential and commercial sectors, we will effectively have a declining cap on building heat. We propose to request Department of Environmental Protection to develop the design for meeting those caps via regulation, including the consideration for a clean heat standard for the state. In a clean heat standard, the projects that transition from an emitting heating source to a non-emitting heating source would receive certain credits. And this could include weatherization and any other transition to heat pumps or other clean energy resources for heating. We're beginning this work to analyze the potential for a clean heat standard to help achieve the emissions reduction that we need and the potential implications and the costs and how to spread those costs. Second thing to highlight is creating a mechanism for building owners to report clean heat metrics, such as energy use intensity and greenhouse gas emissions associated with buildings. We think having a uniform statewide reporting mechanism is a first step toward having a way to standardize the way we report emissions from all different types of buildings across the Commonwealth. Only after having a clear methodology for reporting can we consistently set emission standards in the future. We want to make sure that we achieve equity goals while measuring emissions from buildings. Providing a method for reporting will help disclose energy costs and emissions associated with buildings that change hands either through purchases or lease, and thereby helping renters and buyers to make informed decisions. As you see in the slide here, the last bullet, as part of the recommendation coming out of Commission on Clean Heat, after setting a uniform performance reporting methodology, we anticipate that municipalities, cities, and towns can opt in by using that reporting methodology in a building scorecard at point of sale and lease. We want to align key programs across the state with clean heat goals. This ranges really from small scale, such as adding clean heat guidance, to programs like Leading by Example, to sweeping suggestions to change how utilities plan in their infrastructure investment, and legislation to shift Mass Save's purpose from energy savings to greenhouse gas emission savings. The deliberations at the Commission on Clean Heat is extremely deep and wide, and they have considered many factors, including deliberations about how to improve training, education, outreach. I think everyone involved believes that greater outreach and broader outreach for the Commonwealth will be necessary to really communicate the importance of the transition and how to encourage people to change as they purchase new equipment for their own buildings. The interim CECP discussed the reduction required for the building sector. But here I think we're trying to be a little bit more specific in the policies proposed. Several changes allow the ambitions for building emissions to achieve the building sector emissions by 2030. I think aggressive federal and legislative action to drive reduction in all of these, all of the transportation power and the fluorinated gas will be giving buildings a little bit more room to facilitate the transition to clean energy, because in our prior analysis, we anticipate and we wanted to encourage all home or whole home transition to clean heat or transition to heat pumps. But what we have found is that it may be actually better and more realistic and actually have the transition be more stable and smooth if we can get more people to adopt the clean heat solution and adopt heating heat pumps technology now and take the lessons learned before transitioning to whole home. So we're really doing two things. What we're trying to do here is for the homes that can adopt whole home, we encourage that to happen as aggressively as possible, particularly through our Mass Save program already adopted. And then for those that are needing air conditioning, we hope that they can use heat pumps and learn from those lessons and also use them for heating as we transition out the fossil fuel behind those buildings. This approach, I think, will require also well-coordinated gas and electric system planning. So we will propose strategic electrification and targeted gas infrastructure decommissioning to minimize the potential to invest in additional natural gas infrastructure today that will end up adding to the cost and make the transition more costly in the future. So the coordinated planning is a critical component of this transition for cleaner heat for the building sector. Next slide, please. For the electric power sector, those that are involved in the industry probably know that just about everything we need to build for the power sector will require probably a decade to develop and to build. Therefore, the policies have already really been transitioning for since the last decade, and we're in the process of advancing those policies. What's new are really what's already required under the law. We are adding offshore wind capabilities to procure. We are advancing, of course, the renewable portfolio standard. Again, I mentioned this before, our municipalities through the municipal light plants are reducing their emissions. And we have already increased the funding for Mass CEC for workforce development. The additional investments will be needed for offshore wind, ports and infrastructure, and education and training. For the most part, these policies represent forward planning and coordination to develop really robust project pipeline for the future to make sure we maximize the economic development benefits for the region and for the state. Overall, the power sector requires a continued attention to encourage and development and deployment of clean energy in a responsible way, while retaining all existing non-emitting resources like nuclear and hydroelectric generation. Another effort that has already been ongoing is to develop coordinated regional planning and market reform at the wholesale electricity market. And therefore, Massachusetts is leading the charge with other states, partnering up with other states across New England and working with our system operator of New England to make sure that all the transition that we're developing inside the state and through the state policies are accommodated at the regional level. And these rules are actually facilitated through the federal energy regulatory. So we're also working with our federal partners to ensure that the transition is smooth and while ensuring security and reliability of our electric system for the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier in this presentation, the federal government is moving forward with phasing out the production and the use of HFCs in compliance with the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act of 2020 and the International Kigali Agreement. Massachusetts Department of Energy and Environmental Protection is also moving forward with their updated solid waste master plan for 2030 that seeks to reduce solid waste disposal by 30% by 2030. I think a new notable addition to these policies is a proposed legislative change to the gas system enhancement plan that currently requires natural gas utilities to upgrade all leaky pipes, which continually increase the life of existing gas systems. We should work with our legislative partners to change this policy so that the strategic electrification can be accompanied by targeted decommissioning of antiquated gas pipelines instead of continuing to replace them with new pipes. Next slide, please. Natural and working land. And for the first time, we're going to have a dedicated chapter that's really focused on our natural working land. As many have said, this is our resource. This is the resource that we will need to capture and to sequester any carbon emissions that's left over in 2050. So we must protect our land and trees from conversion. And the central strategy of our plan is to protect our land and trees. Other strategies include managing our natural and working lands for carbon sequestration, improved resilience. We need to restore our natural and working lands for decreased emissions and enhance carbon sequestration. We want to incentivize durable wood products and extend carbon storage and explore additional carbon sequestration resources beyond our state borders. In this plan, under the umbrella of what is also being discussed under resilient land initiatives, we're proposing significant increase in funding for state land acquisition, land conservation grants, farmland protection, particularly for farms that do not qualify for agricultural preservation program due to federal criteria, as well as increased funding for healthy soil practices as part of the existing Massachusetts Coordinated Soil Health Program. We're proposing to increase urban tree planting as a part of the Greening of the Gateway Cities program, and we're launching a new program that aims to plant trees along bodies of water to increase carbon sequestration while protecting water quality, increase wildlife habitat in and along rivers, streams, lakes, and ponds. We propose to launch the Forest Resilience Program as a pilot program for the next 5 years to encourage climate smart forest management and to keep our forests longer. We propose to launch Forest Viability Program, which aims to support forestry businesses in Massachusetts and scale up the production of and the market for durable wood products. Over 85% of the wood products we use here in Massachusetts come from out of state, where forests may not be sustainably managed as they are here in Massachusetts. So to scale up the durable wood product market here in Massachusetts, we can enhance carbon sequestration in our forests while supporting communities and economies in more rural areas of the Commonwealth. To prepare for the Forest Viability Program, we will commission a study of common uses for Massachusetts timber, the barriers and opportunities to scale up durable wood product markets in Massachusetts, as well as the workforce needed to enhance that market. To supplement current and new tree planting programs, we're proposing a portion of the municipal vulnerability preparedness grant money be designated to greening projects that provide both cooling respite for urban communities and additional carbon sequestration in our forests. To complement actions proposed in the Resilient Land Initiative you see on the slide here, we're proposing that forest conversion be a new mandatory threshold in our MEPA environmental impact review. The Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection needs to update its wetland regulation to require no net loss of stored carbon in the wetland replication standards and to streamline the permitting process for wetlands in the outer 50 feet of the wetland buffer zone. This is an incentive for development to be sited further away from wetlands. The Mass DEP to streamline the permitting process as well for wetland restoration projects. To further encourage extended carbon storage from our trees and a reduction in embodied carbon in building construction, we propose that state-funded construction projects be evaluated on the cost of carbon emissions. This action goes further than the recent executive order, which requires development of guidance on how state agencies can incorporate embodied carbon and the internal cost of carbon in the emissions calculation and program. From all of these existing and new efforts, you see as the metrics, we hope to permanently protect 28% of our natural working lands from conversion by 2025 and 30% by 2030. We aim to plant at least 5,000 more acres of trees by 2025 and more than 16,000 more acres by 2030. And we aim to have 20% of privately owned forests and farms be managed for carbon sequestration and resilience, and no net loss of carbon in wetlands by 2030. And then 20% of timber harvested in Massachusetts to be used in durable wood products. In addition to these policy goals, we're also discussing setting a net emissions goal for the natural working lands. This will be compliant with the statutory requirement of the 2021 climate law, even though we were not setting this as a sector-specific emission sublimit. We've had a technical workshop where the technical subject matter experts have gathered together to talk about merits and concerns and options for setting net emissions goals for natural working lands. So we're aiming to at least maintain the current carbon sequestration capacity on our lands into the 2025 and 2030 timeframe. So those are the details of the policies. I highlighted a few of them for each of the sectors. Next slide, please. As a next step, we're finalizing the Clean Energy Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030 in the coming months. We just had public hearing yesterday and today. We hope that you find this useful. The content of this hearing and the numbers that you see in the slide deck, please treat them as draft limits and sublimits and policies, because we're still finalizing our analyses and all the modeling associated with setting those limits sector by sector. So we will be receiving, reviewing, and synthesizing the comments that we have already received and that we're about to receive through this comment period. And so we hope that you will submit written comments or send email to gwsa@mass.gov. If you download this this slide deck, you can click on this portal on this slide and you can directly draft your comments that way. We will be updating, as I mentioned, the emissions limits, sublimits, goals, and policies based on the final modeling results, which we're working really hard on to close those over the next few weeks. The final Clean Energy Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030 will be submitted to the legislature on or by July 1st and posted on our website. So this is the end of our prepared presentation. Thank you very much for listening. And now it's my turn to listen to your comments. So for most of that, we will stay sort of in tune with trying to listen to your comments. We do hope that whoever has already submitted comments or voice or spoke up in the previous two sessions, if you can allow other commenters to comment first, that would be great. And if you're commenting, in case there are other people in the queue, if you can keep your comments to 2 minutes, we would greatly appreciate it, just so that everybody has a turn. Thank you so much. And I will hand it back to Nicole. Actually, if you can flip to the next slide. Oh, you already have it. If you raise your hand via Zoom, we will unmute you. No, we will invite you to speak and then you can unmute yourself. And if you're joining by phone, if you can press *9 to raise your hand. And once we invite you to speak, you can press *9 to unmute yourself. In addition, if you submit other questions in the Q&A, we'll try to answer it offline. But we're not capturing those as formal written comments. So if you have formal written comments, please do submit them as in written form via email or via the form. Thank you very much for listening, and it's my time to listen to you.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna go with who has raised their hands first. So Ben Butterworth, I have unmuted you. If you can unmute yourself, you can now speak.
Great, thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to provide oral comment. My name is Ben Butterworth, and I'm the Senior Manager of Energy and Climate Analysis at Acadia Center. Acadia Center is a nonprofit research and advocacy organization committed to advancing the clean energy future by offering real-world solutions to the climate crisis. So after reviewing the 2030 CECP policies and key targets, Acadia Center has several concerns and recommendations. As it relates to the building sector, the presentation mentions expanding the definition of electric space heating to explicitly include hybrid heating solutions. For example, a heat pump serving greater than 50% of heating demand with a backup fossil fuel system. This is a significant change from the metric included in the interim CECP, which called for the full electrification of approximately 1 million housing units and full electrification of 300 to 400 million square feet of commercial building space by 2030. All electric buildings have a clear path to carbon neutrality as the grid becomes carbon-free over the ensuing decades. However, homes and businesses that continue to rely on hybrid gas heating systems do not, particularly if these buildings are relying on gas to supply nearly half of their total heating demand. This less aggressive hybrid heating metric results in a proposed GHG emission sublimit for the building sector by 2030 that's 37% higher than the sublimit initially proposed in the interim CECP. Promoted hybrid heating systems has ramifications beyond 2030, as many of the fossil fuel boilers and furnaces installed over the next decade will still be operational well into the 2040s and even 2050s. Acadia Center hopes that the CEC proposal to rely heavily on hybrid heating systems is not the direct result of the findings of the recently released DPU 2080 Future of Gas report. The study pushes the narrative that a heavy reliance on hybrid gas heating systems offers a potential cost-effective pathway for economy-wide decarbonization. But the analysis underlying this narrative is significantly flawed. The analysis leans heavily on biomethane, often referred to as RNG in the hybrid electrification scenario, with RNG accounting for over 80% of total energy flowing through the pipes to homes and businesses in 2050 under that scenario. Several of the key flaws in this analysis include making a blanket assumption that all forms of RNG are carbon neutral. Number two, overestimating the supply of RNG that will actually be available to the Commonwealth in the future and downplaying the intense level of future competition for biomass feedstocks from other states and other sectors of the economy. Number three, underestimating the future price of RNG, assuming that it'll be available at a significantly lower price than more reasonable projections suggest. Simply put, there is no viable path to full decarbonization of the building sector using hybrid gas heating systems, as much as the LDCs would like for one to exist. I urge EEA and the building working group to take a closer look at some of the troubling assumptions in the future of gas analysis before committing to a pathway that leans heavily on hybrid gas heating systems. Secondly, as it relates to the transportation sector, intelligently deploying electric vehicle charging infrastructure will be essential to achieving the 2030 GHG emission sublimits. However, Acadia Center has several concerns related to proposed EV charging targets in the CECP. The target of achieving 75,000 public level 2 and DC fast chargers installed by 2030 should be broken out into two metrics. One for the number of public level 2 EV chargers installed and one for the number of public DC fast chargers installed. Bundling these targets together muddles the fact that these two types of chargers with very different speeds of charging serve very different roles in accelerating EV adoption. Most public level 2 EV chargers are a nice to have, while having a sufficient number of DC fast chargers located along key corridors is absolutely essential for quelling range anxiety and accelerating EV adoption. None of the shared metrics related to EV charging mention goals for deployment in either new or existing multifamily construction. This is where level 2 chargers and even the slower level 1 chargers really shine and are desperately needed. The stretch code and net zero stretch code proposed by DOER only call for 10% and 20% respectively of parking spaces in multifamily residential buildings to be EV ready. Simply put, this is not enough charging for residents living in multifamily buildings, given the anticipated speed of EV adoption called for in the CECP. Not all residents of multifamily buildings need parking, but each unit that does come with dedicated parking needs access to at least one EV charger. This principle also doesn't just apply to new construction. The Commonwealth must also prioritize rapidly expanding EV charging infrastructure to existing multifamily buildings that already have on-site parking. Access to EV charging in multifamily residential buildings isn't just a climate issue, it's an environmental justice issue. EV adoption has been disproportionately concentrated among wealthy, white, single-family homeowners. Prioritize expanding EV charging access to multifamily residents is a critical part of making EVs more accessible to less advantaged residents of the Commonwealth. I urge EEA and the Transportation Working Group to consider establishing aggressive measurable metrics related to deployment of DC fast charging along key corridors and deployment of EV chargers in multifamily residential buildings. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. And I'm going to move to invite Janet Williams to speak. Janet, you can unmute yourself.
Yes, I have. Hello. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Janet Williams. I'm the Vice President of the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative. And I want to start by thanking Undersecretary Chang and EEA for this opportunity to provide comments on the 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan. We've been encouraged by the continuous improvements we've seen made to the plan over the past course of the past year's hearings. So the Cape Cod Climate Change Collaborative is a nonprofit with a mission to reduce our region's contributions to the emissions that drive climate change and to manage and reduce disastrous unavoidable impacts. We are a true coalition of diverse interests and include among our stakeholders dozens of organizations, businesses, educational and scientific institutions, municipalities, and literally thousands of individuals, all united primarily by our shared fate of residing on Cape Cod, a particularly vulnerable region threatened by climate change impacts. The Climate Collaborative supports the 2030 plan and the improvements made during this public comment period. Our perspective on the final version that emerges is characterized by some of the unique aspects of Cape Cod. First, Cape Cod is a rural area, but is also largely fully developed with little area still available for new residential construction. Therefore, we support making the Stretch Energy Code mandatory and effective statewide and applicable to substantial renovation of existing properties as well as new construction. We also support incentivizing efforts to expand access to energy efficiency and clean heat systems for low and moderate income residents. The second aspect is that Cape Cod is a sprawling area without the densities that facilitate mass transit systems. As a result, significant miles are traveled per vehicle. In addition, we're a seasonal economy with hundreds of thousands of visitors arriving each summer, virtually all by private vehicle. Therefore, we support establishing the 2030 target of 1 million new EVs that the 2050 roadmap says we'll need, establishing targets for the number of charging stations available to the public, deploying a large number of fast charging stations along the state highways in Cape Cod for our hundreds of thousands of seasonal visitors. And we echo the comment that was just made, urging providing incentives for EV charging installations at multifamily properties who do not have access. Third, and finally, Cape Cod is highly vulnerable to ocean-related climate impacts, especially from sea level rise, storm surge, erosion, and the resulting loss of natural systems that both mitigate against climate change by sequestering carbon and protect us against the impacts. Therefore, we support the development of robust and effective sequestration accounting and market frameworks. And we also support strengthening protections for forest lands, including woodlands and wetlands, both inland and coastal. We support creating incentives to facilitate coastal restoration, wetland restoration projects. We also support including recommendations in the final plan for priority measures, monitoring programs, data collection, and resources for private landowners, including voluntary landowner programs, conservation easements, tax incentives, land use policies, model zoning bylaws, and other tools that can be used. Again, we thank you for the opportunity to provide this comment. We will be providing a written commentary before the April 30th deadline. And thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'm moving on to Stephen Dodge. I invite you to speak.
Thank you. I didn't prepare formal comments. I'm Stephen Dodge from Clean Fuels Alliance America. I did have a question that I put in the comment section, but I did want to just point out one thing that I think it's worth noting, and the timing is good. I think even as we speak, the Vermont Senate is debating a bill that would implement a clean heat standard for the thermal heating sector in that state. Passed fairly overwhelmingly in the House. It's up before the Senate today, came out of a Senate committee earlier this week. And we think that that provides an excellent model template that Massachusetts, as well as other states, should look at in establishing a really viable and effective clean heat standard. And particularly what we like about it is the language in Vermont includes really a universally accepted greenhouse gas accounting method, which is also vitally important. The question I asked is in the building slide that Judy referenced, there was, I think the exact wording was 20% for fuel oil, and I'm guessing that means B20 bioheat. Maybe if you could clarify that. I think that was in the 2030 plan. And I would also just suggest that the states around us have legally mandated through legislation higher amounts by 2030, particularly New York, I'm sorry, particularly Rhode Island and New York. The New York standard is B20 by 2030, but both Rhode Island and Connecticut have established higher mandates for bioheat by 2030. And I appreciate the opportunity to comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. And moving to Lucia Dolan.
Yep. Yeah, I'm here. Thank you for letting me talk. I'm Lucia Dolan. I live in Newton. I'm speaking mainly about asking you to include electrification of the commuter rail along with the electrification of the buses and private cars in Newton. We have a lot of development along our commuter rail line, and electrifying the commuter rail will not only reduce the diesel from the current commuter trains, but it also increase the move towards reducing vehicle miles traveled by giving more people the opportunity to have alternatives. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I move to Bajan. I invite you to speak. Are you able to unmute yourself? Okay, I'm gonna move on to Anna and then see what's going on with that. Anna, are you able to unmute yourself?
I am. Thank you very much. My name is Anna Vanderspeck, and I work with Green Energy Consumers Alliance. We're a local nonprofit based in Boston, and I specifically work on our transportation work. So my colleague Kai might have given comments yesterday about buildings and electricity, but I'll focus on transportation. I wanted to first thank you for all the work that you've done on this section. One of our main comments back in March of 2021, if that's the right date, was we really need to focus on VMT reduction in addition to electrification. So I'm really heartened that that was heard and put in place in this new draft. And also that the electrification focus is on light duty vehicles in addition to medium and heavy duty vehicles. So all of that is needed for this transition to be really comprehensive. I also did not prepare formal comments, but one thing that we have been thinking about in reviewing these materials is that the 2025 goal in terms of EV adoption seems achievable. We noted that it was reduced from the 300,000 set in the original ZEV mandate down to 200,000. And based on our estimation of the market, we can probably meet that. The 900,000 EVs by 2030 is going to need a lot more support. So that's something that we need to think about now and up until 2030 and not leave until 2029, as I'm sure you know. One thing that we have been looking into is the value of setting an earlier date by which the state would aim to phase out the sale of new gas-powered cars as a mechanism by which we could coordinate and align the actions of different state agencies. So that is something we will send in written comments about. But lastly, I wanted to comment on the charging infrastructure build out. I wanted to second Ben Butterworth's comment about separating out level 2 and DC fast charging stations in the number estimates for 2025 and 2030, because those do serve really different use cases. And in terms of tracking progress, it'll be really key to see how that breakout falls. And the question or comment I wanted to make lastly is particularly on that build out of electric vehicle charging stations. I'd be really curious, and I think it's important to include in the text, if we get off track, if charging infrastructure doesn't get built out at a rate needed to meet those goals, what are the tools at the state's disposal to increase deployment of those charging stations? And I think this comes back to my earlier comment about coordination, that I would really like to see the Department of Public Utilities internalize that goal about the number of charging stations and have that inform the way that they handle dockets that come before them. So I will stop there so I don't take up any more time, but we will send in written comments, and thank you for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. And Under Secretary, it looks like that was all the hands that were raised.
Great. Thank you so much for your comments.
We do have one more hand that just raised. Take one more.
Yeah, since we have time, we have additional time. Feel free to raise your hand and comment.
Okay, Cindy, I invite you
Hey.
to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Cindy Ahrens. I'm a member of the Sustainable Lexington Committee in Lexington, Massachusetts. I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak and for your work on the CECP. I know that our town had provided comments in last year, about a year ago, on this, and I just wanted to reiterate the importance of all of these sectors. And I appreciate laying out the individual sectors. The one thing I would like to, and I do appreciate the sort of the adding of consideration for environmental justice and lower income communities, and making sure that they're part of the transition and aren't left behind. I would also like to add, there was a question earlier in the Q&A about estimating costs. And I would request that in any cost analysis, when moving to, especially in the transportation and building sectors, to electrification of those sectors, to really also look at the costs for the consumers, for the individual themselves long term, not just making the transition what it costs to, say, put in a heat pump or what it costs to buy an electric car, but the costs long term to operate those. And also maybe even things like health costs and resilience costs, with the being more, are we more or less prone to climate impacts, to storms and flooding, et cetera. So I think that we have, it's very clear that we have the technology available to us. It's just about deciding, how fast we can do this rollout, which we really do have to be aggressive. And so just to please consider, in cost analysis, life cycle cost analysis, health cost analysis, health savings by removing, the combustion of fossil fuel in our state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cindy. And I'll go to Carolyn. Invite you to speak.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'd like to know what is the plan for weaning off of natural gas that is used as backup for wind and solar. A considerable amount of gas is needed, and we think that a good solution would be to use nuclear fission. I mean, fusion, of course, when it's ready, but fission is something that has been used in this country for over 50 years. There's currently 93 nuclear power plants running safely throughout the states. And we believe that it's a viable solution that is being ignored in Massachusetts.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn, for your comment. And I will now invite Senator Barrett, if you could unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you very much for conducting this session today. I want to thank you and Undersecretary Chang for a very serious effort here. You've clearly given a lot of thought to this. I appreciate how difficult these problems are, and it's clear to me that you're trying to tackle this question in all its breadth. I do want to subscribe to the comments made today that I think could improve the exercise even more. And I want to specifically mention the action of the Massachusetts State Senate last evening. We passed a 2022 climate bill. In parliamentary terms, this is a response to earlier action by the Massachusetts House of Representatives in passing legislation largely focused on the production of offshore wind energy. The two, the focused House effort and the wide-ranging Senate effort, which touches on clean energy, but also on transportation and buildings and a host of related issues, now have to be reconciled and in what we all know as the conference committee process. Your input, the administration's input, and of course the input of everyone listening now is welcome as the House and Senate attempt to reconcile the two bills. We really need to know what would be advisable to legislate as part of this consensus exercise. And given the depth of thinking that EEA is clearly doing with respect to the question, we would like to hear from EEA as to what you would like the House and Senate to legislate in the next 4 months before we go out of session on July 31st, 2022. So just an open invitation, but really a request for steps the legislature should do in this consensus exercise. There is adequate time to take note of your recommendations. And I might add as well that there is some time to take note of the recommendations of others taking part in this call. So I'd certainly welcome the help and the input. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Senator. I appreciate that invitation, and I'm sure we will take you up on that. Thank you.
Terrific.
Okay, it looks like those were all the hands that we had raised right now. Oh, and we have one more. I'll go to Jay Cahill. You can now unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks for having this public hearing. And I am with a group called Sustainable Northborough. We're a citizens group. And we have formed to work neighbor to neighbor to help those of us who have already adopted clean energy technologies to educate and encourage our neighbors to do likewise. So we're moving in the same direction. So glad this, and our goal is to meet the 2030 state climate goals on the municipal community level. One concern that I have noted is that in the transportation sector, electric vehicle models that are now being built for personal use are getting less and less efficient. So most of the new models, or all of the new models, I think other than Teslas, are no longer sedans, they are SUVs. And they're getting less and less efficient, which means we're going to be burning down our grid trying to power less and less efficient vehicles that are potentially in line to get the same incentives as a more energy efficient vehicle. So I would like to see the state, and perhaps in the next round of legislation, to mandate minimum efficiency requirements for electric vehicles to be eligible for incentives. and to make these, affordable models as well as really, great energy efficient models available for people of all income levels. Otherwise, I just wanted to also make a plug for a few things that were said at the hearing today. And one is just to consider life cycle analysis and overall pollution reduction in the technologies that we are promoting and incentivizing. Another thing I just notice on my own is we have regional transportation authorities. They run largely empty vehicles, and I would love to see those get used by more people who aren't able to afford vehicles, and for us to include not only disabled individuals and elderly, but also low-income individuals who can make use of that available public service in some way. Idling ubiquity is everywhere I go, whether it's to parking lots. There are always people idling their vehicles, which is against state law. And we have no enforcement mechanism here in Massachusetts for dealing with that problem. And if you go to an MBTA commuter lot, you're just going to see everyone in their car, regardless of the weather. It can be a perfectly beautiful day, and then they're in there waiting for the train with their vehicle idling. So I really think we need to attack that waste. And otherwise, I'm just looking through my notes here. Again, I really appreciate the process and the thought that's going into this. I really encourage us to build the best possible public policy that considers the unintended consequences, that doesn't, where we're not replacing a polluting technology with another polluting technology, but we're really getting the simple solution that gets us to the best possible endpoint of substantial carbon emissions and other greenhouse gas emission reductions. And this thoughtful process and the public process, I'm very, very grateful for. So thank you.
Thank you. And we'll go to Pine Dubois. You can now unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. And I'm only jumping in here because you have time, but I do want to second what Jay Cahill just said, both in terms of the idling and in terms of the electric vehicles. I think she's right on. And I think to add to that, the municipalities really need a way forward in terms of acquiring electric vehicles. The police, the DPW, the utilities idle worse than anybody. I mean, they have those motors going 24 hours a day, and generally speaking, they're not moving. So I would like to see some incentivization for getting the municipalities to be more leaders, I would say, in this motion. Mostly I jump on because of the Canadian hydro. For years, I've been involved with the people of Labrador and dealing with Hydro-Quebec, and the devastation that is being done as a result of that initiative is not in keeping, I would say, with the goals of the Commonwealth. And I'm glad that you're taking another look at that. As far as solar is concerned, we've been confronting, I would say, solar agriculture. And I know there's been a recent change of regulations that's going to eliminate the deforestation that's going on in southeastern Mass, or at least I hope it will, in terms of the elimination of the pine barrens, because somebody has a cranberry bog next to a sandhill that they're mining as an excuse for getting smart money. And really it's wreaking havoc on the environment. It's not solving anything, let alone contributing to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions with all of the massive earth moving equipment and the trucking that's going on. What I personally have ground mounted solar, and I'm currently trying to figure out how to put geothermal at my place, because I actually have an underground stream under my house that I would like to tap into in terms of plumbing that to heat pumps. I'm having a really hard time finding somebody that is equipped to do that. I think it's eminently doable. My oil furnace absolutely needs to be replaced. And I would like any kind of help that the Clean Energy Alliances or CES can do, or Mass Save can do to help with that. Commuter rail, I think we were commenting on the MEPA And I want to say it was the late 80s when the Plymouth Kingston line was coming back, the old Colony line. And the Secretary of Environmental Affairs at that time said, this must be electrified as soon as possible. And it's still not, it's still running on diesel. And you know, although the fuel they're using now is much better than it was a couple of years ago, at least I'm not getting lead blasted all over the river and everything. So that's a step in the right direction, but I don't see why we can't do that faster. I would encourage more support of education, R&D in terms of the schools so that we can advance smaller electric vehicles to address what J.K. Cahill was saying. You know, we could advance even, you know, better. If you're gonna do nuclear, please don't do the same old nuclear. I'm involved with the NDCAP as you know, and the amount of difficulty that we're going to have with dealing with the waste nuclear fuel is enormous. If we could possibly stimulate more advancement in terms of the research of these small nuclear reactors, I think we would have a better way forward than just trying to think that we're going to do the same old terrible technology that we've used for the last 50 years. With that, I thank you. If I think of anything else, I'll try and submit a written comment. I appreciate the depth of your conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And move to Richard.
Okay. Thank you. With regard to police cars, I live in a fairly liberal town. We would like to buy an electric police car. It's technically not possible. The reason is that the various states or police organizations maintain lists of qualified police cars, and there is no electric car on the list. We could easily get our town to buy one if, in fact, the state would find a qualified vendor of an electric police car and get it on all the lists. It's only a matter of the engineering to prove and getting some manufacturer to agree to produce an electric police car. So I would urge you, as one of the easier things to do is to qualify some vehicle as an electrified police car, and then we can go out and buy it. So thank you very much. This is a wonderful presentation. It shows that you have the right vision, and all of the comments that I have written are only technical details on how things can be improved, and perhaps the state getting out of its own way. The Department of Public Utilities is a very regressive organization. Their disallowance of a high value for the social cost of carbon has forced mass save and program administrators to be less aggressive in meeting all the goals that you've put forth. And by tweaking that one number to make it higher, we could be more aggressive in the programs that we offer. I say we because I'm on the board of the Cape Light Compact, which is the mass save administrator for the Cape and the islands. One other item that you might look into, the Cape and the islands are a sandbar. As such, drilling down for ground source heat pumps is extraordinarily inexpensive. There's no rock involved. But it needs commercialization. It would be great if the state could try to find vendors who will figure out how to do ground source heat pumps, particularly closed loop and vertical ground source heat pumps, because I hope that they can be cost competitive with air source heat pumps in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. There are no other hands right now. I don't know if you want to give it a minute.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your compliments and your feedback, and we definitely take your suggestions to heart, and we will consider your comments and all the other written comments. And thank you again to spend the afternoon on a Friday with us. And I wish you the best weekend. And if those are taking some school vacation next week, have a great vacation. Again, our doors are open. If you want to discuss any of these things more or submit comments, please do so. Thank you again for your participation and your interest in this topic. Thank you.